Welcome to our next presentation, the first principles, reviewing hidden axioms. We have gone through 4 different presentations so far, and yet when we went through those presentations, there were some things that we left out. Some of them were left out because we had to narrow the perspective to only talk about the subject matter at hand. For other things, there wasn't enough time to really get into all the other areas. In other words, we would be too far off topic. So I decided to go back and review some of these hidden perspectives and show that different ways of looking at an event or reality or data, however you want to view it, is important. We can use the scientific method, we can use different philosophies to help bring meaning to this information that we're getting in our everyday lives. There are often a lot of confusion with what's going on. When we look at the news, we see, or we get on Facebook, we see different competing ideologies, always shouting to be heard. And it's hard to tell what is really truth, what is we should really pay attention to, and what stuff is garbage. And so some of the hidden principles that the ancients knew about, I want to go back and review those so that we can have more things in our toolbox when we're talking about reality. Every framework that we use has its limitations. Science has its limitations. Philosophy has its limitations. Religion has limitations. And we're going to talk about some of those limitations and how we need to be aware of how far something can go and what it can be used for. If all we have in our toolbox is a hammer, every problem begins to look like a nail. So we want to make sure that we have a plethora of things in our toolbox so that we can choose the right tool to help us to get to whatever pathway we choose to go on, and to help us to understand what pathway other people are on so as not to be manipulated into doing things that are against our own self-interest. So we're going to start off by reviewing the ancient wisdom PowerPoint that we did earlier. It was our first PowerPoint presentation that was given in Cleveland. And during that presentation, we talked about how language describes reality, how we use language to verify with each other what is really going on. If I see the color red and you agree that you see the color red, then we agree that red exists. And we do that through language. However, what we sometimes fail to keep in mind is that my experience of red, the quality of the experience, can be different than someone else's. Someone who is colorblind might recognize a pattern that he has been trained to say is red, but the quality of the color is not the same. It would be physically impossible for him to see the same color that I'm seeing because maybe he doesn't have the red cones in his eyes are not as developed as my cones. Or maybe I have some extra sensory and I'm seeing different colors and different things that other people don't see because they don't have those cones and they don't have those receptors. Maybe I'm a new, evolution. I've had a slight mutation that helps me to see different things. And so we can never be certain that people are experiencing exactly the same thing that we're experiencing. All we can say for certain is that we have labeled an energy pattern and they're able to recognize that energy pattern and call it by the same label. So that was the first descriptor of the power of words. What we didn't talk about in that PowerPoint, because we were talking about reality, was how words are misused. One thing that we need to realize when people are talking to us is that when it comes to actions that someone can take, words are the least expensive action that they can take. For example, if I have a boyfriend and my boyfriend tells me he loves me, oh, that's a wonderful thing. It makes me feel good. I feel close to him. But I also realize that he didn't have to work very hard to give me those words. Those words were very inexpensive on his part. It only cost him the breath it took to belch it out and to say it to me. What is more important is if he actually does some actions to back up those words. So if I have a boyfriend, a second boyfriend, and this boyfriend never tells me he loves me, but he's constantly giving me his time. Instead of watching the football game, he decides to take me out to a movie. We share different experiences together, but he never ever says the words "I love you." But he's constantly doing things to back that up. That's worth a lot more to me than a guy that constantly tells me he loves me, but then, he's busy doing other things. He has no time to spend quality time with me. He doesn't take me anywhere. He doesn't spend any money on me. And so actions are always a more expensive expression than words. Words are cheap. The other thing about words is that we rely on good faith, that what the person is telling us is the truth. And so lots of people say different things, and maybe they even believe what they're saying, but it doesn't necessarily represent truth. And a good example of that is someone who, has some type of belief and they espouse that belief, but just because they believe it with all their heart doesn't make it true. So the words themselves are tools for manipulation. We communicate and we verify that things are real through language, but what we have to understand that it should end there, that we should also recognize that these words are not the end all be all. We have more to experience or more personal experience that we cannot communicate or that may not be in agreement with someone else's experience. That is okay. It's okay that there are no words to express these things. What happens is because words do form the basis of our agreement of what is real, it tends to get extended to everything. So when a politician promises us that he's fighting for the good fight to end some type of, I don't know, let's say he's pro-choice and he runs on that platform. But when he gets into office, the first thing he does is help to pass legislation that's exactly the opposite of that. And what we have to realize is that words are cheap. Anyone can say anything. People claim to be Christian and then do things that are exactly opposite to what Christianity stands for. The words are not the important thing. It's the action. Jesus said, "You will know them by their fruits," not by their words, because we can say anything we want to. It's a cheap thing. And we use those words to manipulate people into perceiving or to thinking a certain way about anything so that we can control what it is that they do or how they respond to us. So words are tools to warp perception. And so it has this duality to it. It can be used to form an agreement of reality, or it can warp our reality. if someone misuses words. And so we need to put words in its proper perspective. Yes, we need them to communicate with, but it should end there. After that, we need other tools in order to put words in their proper perspective. So our takeaway of this, the new principles I want people to take away with, is that language is very cheap. It costs the person almost nothing to say anything. But actions are more costly. So the more action someone takes, or the more it costs them in personal energy, then we know that they're really dedicated to that way of thinking. What they say and what they do are in harmony with each other. But if what they say and what they do are not in harmony with each other, then we need to know that the actions should be looked at way more than the words. So here are ways to apply this principle. Listen to what people are saying. Listen to them. But also keep in the back of your mind that the words don't mean anything, that they're the cheapest thing that this person can put out. This is a person that and he hasn't put forth any effort yet. After you listen to them, watch and see what they actually do. If they expend energy to fulfill what it is that they're talking about, then you know that they really meant what they said. If, however, when you watch their actions, it is different than what they said, then you know that they were just saying some stuff just to placate you, to twist your mind, to twist perception. And at that moment, when you discover a trend in their behavior, you make a decision on what you are going to do. You create your own plan of action so that you continue to go in the direction you want to go, and then execute that plan. Another point from the ancient wisdom presentation is that we talked about how observation is the only reality. When an event occurs, we experience that. And those experiences are what we call our life. What we see, what we hear, what we see, taste and smell, and the sensations that we get through our body. All of these things are our life. That is all that we have. Where the confusion comes in is that, people tell us, well, science says this and science says that. But you need to understand that science studies causation of an event. So we observe an event, and the event is always real. That is your reality, period. Science then tries to figure out why the event occurred or what triggered the event. So it runs experiments to see if they can repeat the event on demand. And if they can repeat the event, then it means that they've discovered a cause or a possible cause of the event that you've experienced. And by doing that, we can then trigger an event at will, which is the whole point of science. But everything, whether it's science or whether it's, anything that we are experiencing in life, it begins with our observation. Everything begins with observation. The things that we didn't talk about or that were missed in that opportunity to talk about observation and reality is that everything that we observe is real. Because reality only occurs in the mind anyway, what you experience is your reality. If you're hearing voices inside of your head, that is real for you. And we need to be able to distinguish between the event that we're experiencing and our rationalizations of it. So if I'm hearing voices in my head, I could say demons are talking to me. Well, demons are talking to me. That part of the statement is a rationalization. It's not necessarily true. It's what I think is true. The event, hearing auditory noises, happened because I experienced it. And when someone comes along and tells you, oh no, those aren't real, they're lying to you. If you're experiencing if you experience an event, it's real for you. Um, so what science tries to do is discover, well, what triggers this event? What is triggering these voices in your head? And it runs experiments, and it discovers that if they give you a certain drug, you stop hearing the voices. Well, one of the things about um, this whole observation deal is that these experiments that you run, unless it's 100% one-on-one, every time I push this button, a light comes on. That's the only time I can say that this is an actuality. This causes that. Flicking this light switch causes the light to come on, because 99.999% of the time when I flick the switch, the light comes on. Now, there's the few occasions when maybe the light's blown out, or maybe something happened with the circuit and it stops working. It got blown out some kind of way. That this does not work. This trigger does not work. But for the majority of the time, if it's close to 100%, you can say with a certainty that this actually causes that. And the difference here is that a lot of times when we hear information about a study that was done, just simply saying science said automatically makes it fact, which we should be leery of. No, that is not the case. What we have to see is, what was the event? What is it that they're studying? What was the observation? And now, with the experimentation, how many of the test subjects actually triggered the event or had the event? If they say, and we also, of that, we need to also look at other things, such as outcomes. How many outcomes could there be? An example of that would be there's a drug we want to test to see if it cures a certain ailment. We have a population of maybe 50, 100 people. Let's say 100 people. 50% of them got better. And the other 50% didn't. Well, the question is, how many outcomes were possible with taking this medicine? And if there's only one outcome, that everybody dies when they take this medicine, then that means that we can say with 100% accuracy that the medicine doesn't work at all. However, if 50% of them gets better and 50% of them don't get better, and those are the only two outcomes that can happen, then the odds are no better than chance. It's totally up to chance. However, if we have something where there are 10 different outcomes that can happen, and 50% of people have outcome A, and the rest are spread amongst the other 9, then we can say that there's a high probability that this trigger, whatever it is that we're testing, has some effect on the population, because 50% out of a possible 10 different outcomes all have this one outcome. And so that's a significant amount. And so we can say that probably the trigger that we're testing is working. The probability is high that this trigger works in 50% of the people who who had, option A. But a lot of things are possible without actually being, a lot of times when I'm reading different scientific journals, I hear, um, it's probably this or that, when really what they're saying is it's a possibility. A good example would be one of the UFO things that I read, and the government came out and said it was probably swamp gas. It's probably swamp gas that they saw. Okay, first of all, no one did any measurements of anything for the actual event that occurred. So that was point number one. So we really don't know what they saw. They saw something. The event occurred. Many people saw it, but we don't know what they saw. And to come up and say, well, it was probably swamp gas, is just, instead of it being a probability, it is instead a possibility. It's one possibility of many. And that a possibility is a range of different things. It could have been swamp gas. It could have been, a metallic balloon, one of those mylar balloons that got away and the sun reflected off of it. Could have been a good many different things. A lot of things are possible. That doesn't necessarily tell you that that's what it was. And so I'm very weary or leery of hearing of things that should be labeled as a possibility being labeled as something higher, as a probability. It's probably this. The only way that we could say that it's a probability that it's a certain thing is if we ran experiments on that particular event at the time of that event, and we did measurements, and we looked at all the things that were in the area at the time of the event that occupied the same space at the same time, and narrowed it down to that as being the cause, the probable cause. But what happens is this was all after the fact, and it was all conjured up out of nowhere. There were no tests done, no measurements taken, and putting some explanation forth after the fact without it being tied to the actual event is just, it's just intelligent guesses and doesn't make it a fact. So, we have to look at the mechanisms of what people are telling us, because we rationalize a lot of different things and we make those things sound like truth when really there's nothing substantiating it at all. And so we have to look at things very carefully. So the new principles that I want you to walk away with here is that observation is the only reality. The event is that you experience is the only reality that there is. Everything else is trying to explain causation of the event. And causation is not the same as observation. How do we apply these principles? We determine the difference between what is causality and what is the actual event. So whenever you read anything, whether it's a scientific paper or it's a philosophy or it's a description of an accident, let's say an accident occurred and you have 10 people that say that a car ran the red light, and another 5 people who say no, it actually ran through a yellow light and hit this car. Well, the event is the car got hit. There was an accident. The causation would be these different people's observation that, did it run through the red light? Did it run through the yellow light? I mean, the timing is of issue. And then Someone comes along, they do measurements, they say, well, did the car that was turning on the yellow light, did it hit the car that ran through the red light? Did it hit it in the side? Or did the car that ran through the red light hit the car that was turning in the side? Because that's going to determine who hit whom is a big sign that tells you what happened. If this guy was turning and this other guy ran, car A was turning and car B ran the red light and hit the first car A, then where it hit the car tells you a little bit about the timing. If it hit it near the front, then maybe it ran the yellow light. If it hit it near the back end, it probably ran the red light. And so we can look at these different measurements that support or give evidence to one theory of causation over another theory of causation. But before we do any of that, we have to separate the actual event, which is the accident. The accident occurred from the theory of causation. We have to also ask ourselves how many outcomes are possible from this. You know, if there are only two outcomes, like the flipping of a coin, it's either happened or didn't happen. Then when someone says 40% of people, had this occur in something with an outcome that only had two possible outcomes, then we know that anything that's 50% is random chance. I mean, that is like flipping a coin. If it's slightly less, like 45%, or slightly more, 55%, it's still within the range of random chance. And then we can ignore that. If there are more outcomes than that, then it can have a lower probability and still have some significance. The higher, the more outcomes that are possible, and the percentage becomes more sensitive. So 50% that with 10 possible outcomes is very significant. If there's only one outcome, if every time you do a trigger, you only have the one outcome, then you know that is an actuality. This actually causes that. And so we can look at this information that we're getting on a daily basis, whether it's from a politician or from some scientific study or from some religious person who's making some claim. We can put it through these different tests to kind of sift through and narrow down what is significant and what is merely someone talking off the top of their head. And trust me, lots of people are talking off the top of their head, and it doesn't mean diddly squat. So moving on, we had another presentation called Oneness and Duality. And in that presentation, we talked about how duality is an illusion, how what we are looking at is really only one thing. When we're talking about good and evil, we're talking about energy. And if the energy is moving towards us and into us, and we're getting, we look at that as something good. If the energy is moving away from us, is taking something out of our sphere of influence, then, and we look at it as something evil. And lots of physical things are also set up that way. There really is not hot and cold. There's only heat and the absence of heat. So there's really only the one thing, but we see it as a dualism because we're always looking at things from the perspective of self. From, is it coming in or out? And that's where the duality comes in. Well, there really is no duality. It's just energy. It all is. And it's moving. How it moves and where it moves is what gives us the sense of it being two-sided. What we didn't talk about is truth and how truth is perceived from that dualistic model. When we're talking about truth, we need to understand that since dualism is caused by our personalized view, that as many people who are experiencing events, will have their own truth of that event. The way that they experience it and what they've experienced will be entirely different than what you experience. And that's totally fine. Um, Perhaps we, at some point, we will learn to let it go, to not want to validate our own selves by diminishing the experience of someone else. Maybe we'll get beyond that. We also need to understand that science is only one perspective out of many. And one of the reasons why I'm making this presentation is to offer some more perspectives, some more ways of looking at things. Um, Truth is also conditional. So I could tell you that water is a liquid. And you would say, oh, yeah, that's true. But really, it's only true under certain conditions. It has to be at a certain pressure and temperature. And within that range of pressure and temperature, you will find water is a liquid. However, go outside of those conditions, and water is no longer a liquid. It could be a solid or it could be a gas. And if you go too far out of those, it will even turn into a plasma. But we don't even want to go there. What we really need to focus on is that our language is very lazy, and we tend to leave the conditions under which something is true out. We make a blanket statement, and because a lot of people are not aware of the different conditions, they tend to hear it and understand it as being absolute, and there is no such thing. Truth is a layered onion. It is found within a certain context and under a certain condition. Now, what I mean by context is that um, I'll explain that one with a personal experience of mine. So, a long time ago, I had a boyfriend, and this boyfriend had an accident in which he cracked a rib. Even though he went to the doctor and got pain medicines and whatnot, he was in some pain. And on this particular day, he had a headache and he was sweating profusely. And I noticed that he was sweating and he looked discomforted. And I asked him, are you feeling okay? And he told me he had a little pain in his rib from where he had his accident. But he had still wanted to go out with me that day. And we happened to be driving around Belle Isle. And I looked out the window and I saw 3 trees that had something that looked like an aura around those trees. They were glowing with an orange glow. They looked like they were on fire. And I told him that. I said, oh, you see those trees over there? They look like they're on fire. Well, he didn't see what I saw. He didn't see anything but normal trees out there. And I told him that I had a feeling that if we went over to those trees, where those trees were, that they would heal him. So, and I convinced him to try it out with me. Well, he did it totally on faith. He was not seeing anything or feeling anything of what I was feeling or seeing. He could have just as easily told me that I was full of pookie and that we were doing no such thing, but he was curious, and he wanted to please me, I guess, go along with my craziness, and so we went. And I instructed him that I would touch the tree, and that all he had to do was hold on to me. So he grabbed one of my arms, and I told him, hold on to me. And I found one of the trees, and I put my hands on the tree. Well, the instant I touched the tree with both my hands, we both flew back like 2 feet. We flew back. It felt like electricity went through us. And he did experience that part of it. Even though he didn't see the glow around the tree, he did experience being blown back on his tuchus, just as I was blown back on mine. And when we got up, I asked him how he felt. And he told me that all the pain was gone, and that his headache was gone, and all of that. Now, he could have just been humoring me because words are not expensive, right? You can tell anybody anything you think they want to hear to warp perception. However, I noticed that he wasn't sweating anymore. He wasn't sweating. And we went out to dinner after that, and he wasn't sweating. And the other thing was, he actually flew back when I flew back. At the same moment that I flew back and fell down, he flew back and fell down. So, um, and we marveled over this event. But after the event, when I looked back at the trees, all the glowing was gone. Well, it had dissipated, or the energy had been used. Now, from my perspective, that context, if I were to look at it from a scientific perspective, none of it would make sense. Number one, there was no, how could I measure anything? What was to be measured? Um, I would have to come up with something that could be measured and repeated. There was no way that that event was ever going to be repeated, at least because I didn't, first of all, understand how it happened in the first place, nor did I understand how to make it happen again. It was just an event that occurred, and when it occurred, I had a feeling that we should do such and such. I don't know why I had those feelings or those ideas in my head, but I did, and we followed through on them. And so, in that context of science, there's nothing to be done there. There's nothing to measure. Um, we could probably measure if we had taken his temperature before the event. Maybe we could have measured his temperature after the event with a thermometer, but none of that was done. The event was unplanned. Okay, it wasn't set up as in experimental context, and so there was no way to explain such an event in that context. However, later on, when I started learning about Kabbalah, I could look at and examine that event in the context of Kabbalah. For in Kabbalah, the fiery flame that I saw around those trees is a part of Atzilus. It is a manifestation of that energy. And I could then look at it and think about the event in that context, where I couldn't think of it in the context of science. So it allows me to peruse an event which otherwise makes no sense and which otherwise has no structure or purpose, but now it does within that context. And that's what I mean by truth within a context. If my toolbox only had science in it, I would have been totally lost. But because my toolbox includes quite a few things, I can take an event and look at it through the lens of any of these things. The next thing that I want to talk about as far as layered truth is something called a key joint. Now, this concept comes from reading the philosophies of Carlos Castaneda. And in Carlos Castaneda's books, he talks about key joints. Whenever you have a complex system, which is what we live in, our reality, if it doesn't meet down into one specific truth, there are a bunch of things that come together, and when all these things come together in such a way, we get an event. What a key joint is a point in that complex structure where we can cause a failure. To illustrate the specific incident in his books that he talked about, Don Juan said that he could cause the car through his sorcery not to work. And of course, Carlos gets in his car and tries to start it, and it doesn't start. And Don Juan is doing something to the engine. and he calls it attacking a key joint. He finds one small piece in the car that requires only a little bit of energy to throw it out of whack, and the whole thing doesn't work. Another example of that, we can talk about maybe I make a phone call. I make a phone call to a friend in California. And in between, there is a bunch of things that has to occur. Um, the phone has to be hooked up to an electrical source. It has to also be hooked up to the telephone wires. There are connections that have to occur between here on a landline between here and California. If any of those things fail, I might not be able to make my phone call. One last example of a key joint would be Jacques Fresco. In one of his talks, he talks about how his nephew asked him, "How does a car work? What is it that makes a car work?" He says, "This is the gas." And he says, "Well, yeah, the gas is one of the points that helps it to work, but the gas would be nothing without the engine." I was okay, well, is it the engine? Well, that's fine, but if you didn't have oxygen to come in and mix with the gas, then, the car still wouldn't work. And so he started naming off these different key joints that all these things have to come together in perfect unison in order to get some event to occur. And so we have to realize we're living in a complex reality. And when people say, aha, this is due to this one thing, maybe what they're describing is a key joint. For example, let's go back to the example of where someone's hearing a voice in their head. And they go to the doctor, and the doctor gives them a medication which stops the voices from going on in their head. Well, what they may have done is stopped a key joint. It may not be the cause of the voices in their head. It may be a point between the communication, the brain, and whatever the actual true source of those voices are. And by stopping a key joint, you stop the voices. It's like the phone. I'm on the phone and someone cuts the phone line. Well, they didn't really stop the guy on the other side from talking. That's still going on. What they did is they stopped the ability to communicate by stopping one of the key joints. And so we need to look at truth as being a complex system, not something that does not necessarily narrow down into this or that, but that it has many points along the way that if any of those things fail, the event would not occur. So let's put some new principles into place. Reality is complex, and it has many points of failure. Showing that something can fail does not necessarily prove cause. Again, in the example of the voices in the head, using a drug to suppress a certain part of the brain does not necessarily mean that this originated in the brain. It just tells us that this was a key joint and they disrupted one of the key joints in the process of this event. Not necessarily the cause of the event, but it prevents the event because it is a key joint. The other thing we need to understand is that our personal experience is not equal to the sum of all experiences. So we can, if 10 people are witness to an event, each person's experience of the event will be slightly different. And that's okay. When we talk to the people and we find out that their truth, their experience is different than ours, we shouldn't get all bent out of shape. We should understand that that's just par for the course. That is the way, the nature of the beast, right? That there are going to be some things that are different. And part of that has to do with our personal perspective. It has to also do with our physical body. what it's capable of seeing, what it's capable of hearing, the ranges it's capable of hearing. All of these things come into play. All of these things are key joints in the event itself. So how do we apply these principles? We need to ask ourselves, what is our own personal truth? And look and see how it is different than the people around us. We experience things on the daily that when we talk to our neighbor, they can see the same event, they can see the same presidential election and come to an entirely different conclusion. And it should be fine. Understanding that their experiences, that everything goes into how we interpret an event. All of our past experiences, everything comes to bear. Even when we don't, we're trying to keep an open mind on things. Which brings up the point of keeping an open mind. That when you hear a different perspective, don't block it out. It doesn't mean that it's dumb. I meet so many people that think that if it's not the scientific method, it's dumb. It shouldn't be, blah, blah, blah. Not realizing that science is great within its own context. It's a great tool. Not downing science at all. But some of these other things are just as wonderful a tool. And they help to explain things that can't be explained by science. So keep an open mind. Listen to what people are telling you, because they are sharing with you an experience from a different perspective. Compare it to your perspective and then investigate. I had a conversation with a friend of mine not too long ago where we were talking about a certain event. And he wanted proof. And I produced several documents, but he poo-pooed them. He said, that's not really proof. And I said, well, why isn't this proof? And he says, it's not peer-reviewed. It's not, it hasn't been authenticated. Well, that doesn't make it not evidence. It is evidence. It's just not authentic evidence. And if you want to know if it's authentic, you're going to have to do the legwork and go authenticate it. You're going to have to go and see if this is a real document that came from that period, which would then show that this happened at such and such a time. Well, he's like, and his response to me was, well, the scientific method says that it's the burden of proof of the person making the argument to prove their point, and you didn't prove your point. And I says, I have no vested interest in proving a point. I said, for me, it doesn't matter whether you believe this or don't believe it, because it's not going to change reality. If you find out that this bit of information is true, what will it actually change? Nothing. Why would I put all my energy into trying to prove this to you when there is nothing at the end of the rainbow for it, for putting the energy in there? I've got other things to do. So if you're interested in knowing about it, investigate it. If you're not, leave it alone. It's not going to make a difference one way or the other anyway. So, and part of the reason why I'm able to say these things is because I do have these other tools in my. Now, if I only looked at things from a scientific view, then I might feel obligated to run out and go and try to prove that this document is true and legitimate. But really, in the scheme of things, in the scheme of what I'm trying to get to and what I'm trying to accomplish in this life, it's not a priority. And it's not a priority for me to convince anyone of anything. I put the information out there. It's up to you, the viewer, to go and investigate, to look into it if you're interested. If you're not, fine. It's not required. It's not required that you see life the way that I do. The only thing I'm trying to do is to put the information out there, and it's up to you to do what you want to do with it. If it inspires you to look into it further, good. That, for me, what I get out of it is that I have another person with more tools in their toolbox. And so when I have a conversation with you, I can switch to these different contexts and I don't have to worry about losing you along the way. See, people who don't know anything about Kabbalah or don't believe in Kabbalah or this or that, I can't talk to them using that context because, or if I do use that context, I have to veil it in normal speak, in everyday language. I can't refer to Kabbalah directly because that would totally throw them off. Just the name Kabbalah, because we put so much weight on language that really shouldn't be there because their words are empty. They don't mean diddly squat. At the end of the day, it's what we do. Okay, so we need to determine what context someone is using when they're talking to us. I meet a lot of people now who are rationalistic, scientific, and that's the only context that they know. And because they have um, no experiences beyond the agreed experience that language provides for us. Um, so we should look for what is the shared truth that we can agree on. Those things that when we look out in the world, I see that, and you say, I agree, I see that same thing. But we should also understand that the things that we don't agree on, those are important too. They're clues to other things that are going on in reality that we may not be privy to because we're not physically equipped to experience certain things or whatever. But if we really, really are interested in knowing the whole truth, then we need to listen and accept that this person's experience, if they're talking about their experience and they're being truthful about their experience, then maybe, we can look into it and investigate it further. I'm not saying take everything that they're saying as God's gospel. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that once they tell it to you, then do some investigation. And here are some tools to do those investigations with. The next presentation that we had in the series was on the Philosopher's Stone. And the Philosopher's Stone, in the Philosopher's Stones, we learned about the alchemists and that even though on the surface they talked about purifying gold, purifying iron and turning iron into gold and making the stone that creates immortality, they were really veiling different processes of purifying the thoughts of man and making them so that they could live better in harmony with each other. And that is why it's called the Philosopher's Stone, because it's trying to get man to have higher realizations of mind so that he can live in better harmony with other people through philosophy. And that these same processes, when applied to chemicals, would have corresponding reactions in the physical, that these processes occur on 4 levels of being. So this is an inclusive philosophy that echoes out into many different dimensions, you might say. We also talked about how the Bible talked about the same thing, and that the alchemists might have gotten the whole idea of creating the Philosopher's Stone from the biblical prophecy of the stone. What we didn't talk about is how, no matter what knowledge it is that we're looking at, all those knowledge, any knowledge can be exploited for any purpose. I can take a pencil and write a beautiful sonnet with it, or I can stab somebody in the eye with it. The pencil itself is not evil or good. My intention is. My intention determines whether it's going to use for self-gain or whether I'm going to use it for the betterment of humanity as a whole. Recently, I saw a video by a rabbi, and he talked about two people who go to the gym. One, the first lady wants to look good. She wants to look sexy so she can go out and find herself a man and look sexy to the man, and and perhaps get married. Okay, and the next woman wants to be healthy so that she can take care of her family better. She wants to feel energetic. So she thinks the way to do that is to go to the gym, work out, and keep her body in tip-top shape. Now, both of these women have two different in, agendas here. One is doing it for selfish reasons. One is doing it for altruistic reasons for her family. And yet they're both doing the exact same thing. They're both, you know, making their bodies stronger. Where the break comes in is that once they've achieved that goal, person A is going to use that achievement to to trap herself a man. Person B is going to use it to help her family. That is where the difference is. The difference is not in the action of going to the gym. These are exactly the same action. The only difference between the two is the intention. So intention determines the direction that reality is going to take. Um, this woman who is uh, going to make herself look beautiful for so that she can go out and get herself a man is taking that energy that she put into making her body beautiful and strong into this pursuit of man. And we need to understand how intention determines the direction that energy is going to flow in. This reminds me of a biblical scripture that talks about how we build according to what's in our heart. What's in our heart is our intention. It's our hidden agenda. It's why we're, the motivation of why we're doing whatever it is that we're doing. And so the important thing to come away with is that why were the alchemists looking for this philosopher's stone? What were they planning on doing with it? A lot of them were looking to live forever, personally live forever. They weren't doing it for anything greater than, uh, benefiting their own selves and being able to stay in positions of power, perhaps for forever. For them, it's a good thing. For the rest of humanity, maybe not so much. The Bible's description of the stone is about the kingdom, which benefits everyone, where everyone lives in harmony and is happy, and this thing grows from strength to strength. And so the intention is different. The two are talking about something similar, but the intention is different. So what do we take away from this? What are the new principles that we can take away from this? Structure is more important than desire. Now, what do I mean by that? We can have an intent to do something, that our true agenda, but always we are limited by whatever structure we're in. So let's say that the lady that wants to go out and find herself a man, who's getting herself beautiful for a man, is living in an area where just about everybody's married. They're already paired up. Not too many singles of note in the area. Well, who then is she using that on? Is she using it on the small pool of singles, or is she using it on the large pool of marrieds? The structure there determines whether the intention is positive or negative, good or evil, you might say. For her, in her personal purview, It doesn't matter to her whether the person is married or not married. She just wants a man. And that desire is the only thing that is important. Now, whether that man is single or married doesn't matter to her. So the thing that becomes the determining factor is the structure. Is the structure where she's going to use her intention or to display her intention or to enact her intention? Is it in a structure that is conducive for what she's wanting to do, or is it in a structure where it's not conducive? Intention guides what structures are built. So, as Jesus said, we build what is in our hearts. If if I'm a capitalist, if I believe in capitalism and I want to hoard up some wealth for myself, I want to become wealthy, well, I'm going to work towards building structures that will help me to do that. But there are greater structures outside of this that I'm going to do that in. So if I build this in a capitalist system, so much the better. That's just par for the course. In my studies of different things, I've come across the idea of resource-based economy. So let's say that there's the outer structure is a resource-based economy where there is no money and there is no hoarding up of things. Someone coming in and having the intention of hoarding up wealth in that structure has a whole different connotation than someone doing it in a structure that's already capitalistic. So we have to address both desire and structure. What is the intention? Where are they going with this? And how does it affect the structure that exists? In what ways? How will it change the structure that exists? Another thing that I think about is, people join different organizations without actually knowing the intent of that organization. Yes, when I read different things about, let's say, secret societies where they have different degrees, and the higher degree that you obtain, the more information about the actual intention of the organization you get exposed to. They don't throw the whole Monty in front of you if you're a neophyte just getting initiated. They don't tell you the whole story. In fact, they may even lie about the true intention. It may be the exact opposite of what they really intend on doing. But as they acclimate you and as they determine that you've accepted each step of the way and you're being led like a sheep to the slaughter without complaint or without questioning, and then they open up that next door for you to step through it, well, unless you take a good assessment of where you started from and what your assumptions were and what you thought the intent was based on whatever it is they said to you, which is worth absolutely nothing, and where you actually are, what has actually happened, the structures that are actually in place and the consequences of those structures, unless you take stock of that and really ask yourself, where is this going? Where is this? What is, and is my intent, what I am intending, is it in alignment with what this is? And a lot of people join things without knowing the intent. They join it because they're lonely. They join it because it's fun. They have very low expectations or low thoughts about where all of this goes and what it all means. But if you really want to take control of your life or take control of, let's say, let's say we all go vote, but we're voting for candidates. We hear what they're saying in the commercials and stuff, but do we really know what their intention is? And is the intention that they think, even that they're working towards, does it really match what is actually happening? So before you give your energy over to some group or you vote for some politician or whatever it is that you're doing, and doing being the key thing, not the stuff you're talking about doing, but that stuff you're actually doing. Before you put energy into it, have you determined beforehand what the intention is? And have you determined if their intention is the exact same as your intention? So, in order to apply this logic or this thinking, we need to ask ourselves, what is the paradigm? What is the thinking? What is the intent? What are the goals, both stated and unstated, of whatever it is that we're looking at? What is the goals of this candidate that I'm supposed to be voting on? What are the goals and what are the actions of this organization that says that they're, feeding the hungry? Are they really feeding the hungry? What evidence do I actually see them doing? One of the things that I've read articles on is how many charitable organizations actually keep 70% of what people donate. They donate money. 70% of that is going into somebody's pocket as wage, and only 30% is actually making it down to the people. Now, they said that you can, do some research, do some due diligence, and find out which ones where it's the reverse. 20 to 30% wind up as wages for the workers, and the rest of it is actually going to, and if that's the case, then, that's a pretty good organization and it's worth donating to. Otherwise, you're just donating to somebody's pocket. Their get-rich-quick scheme. The other thing we need to ask ourselves is, what are the consequences? Even if this person's intent is exactly what they say it is, what are the consequences of what they're doing? What happens with this action? What do we observe happening? Not the philosophies of what people say it's supposed to be. For example, I talk to people who are capitalists all the time, and they point me to these definitions. Well, capitalism is, and they point me to this definition. It's, individual ownership or whatever. And okay, individual ownership. Okay, it's a definition. That's all it is. No, it's more than that. There's a consequence to individual ownership. What is the consequence of that? And where does the logic of it, what is the end result? Where is this going to lead you eventually? And then you have to decide whether or not that's where you want to end up. Do you want to end up there? Do you want civilization to end up there? Are the goals that, or where all this stuff, the consequences lead, is that where you want to be? Is that your intention, to be at that point? And the last thing you need to determine is, when you make changes to the system or to these ideologies in order to align your intent with the overall intent, what things will change? What will you have to change about yourself? What can you change about yourself? What can you change about that organization? Many times it's nothing. You can't change the world around you. The only thing you can change is you. And so the big question is, do you put your energy into this, or do you put it into something else? And if we want change, we have to be the change that we desire. If you want to change something, you can't continue to put your energy into the same things you've always put your energy into. You can't put your energy into the thing that you despise and expect things to change. You have to start putting your energy into other structures that are more conducive to where you actually want to be. If you have any questions, you can join us on Facebook under Jewish and Christian Symbology, or you can also leave some comments in the section under this video, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Have a good evening.